Good evening, everyone. I'm Somnata, CCMB Science Communication Officer. I welcome you all to CCMB Biologue today. CCMB Biologue is a student-led initiative at CCMB where our students invite international experts in life sciences for a detailed interaction. Started last year as the pandemic took over our lives, through Biologue we have been able to meet life scientists who look into these tiny biomolecules and cells, those who study cell behavior, those developing tools to look into these and manipulate the molecules and cells to those looking at life as a large system. From the most fundamental questions of life sciences to developing and harnessing the most cutting-edge technologies, Biologue has been a top series that has brought speakers from all these categories. And all these talks have set an excellent premise for our discussion today. For today, in our 12th Biologue, we are joined by Professor Vidyanand Nanjundiah from the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. Thank you for being with us today. In his talk, he wants to make a case for biology as an autonomous science, going beyond the idea that physics and chemistry suffice to understand biology. We will hear more about him and his work from Dr. Janvi Joshi in a while. Before I give Janvi the mic, a few do's and don'ts for our audience. The talk will run roughly about 45 to 60 minutes. During the talk, you can write your questions in the Q&A box in the Zoom link. Please do not write in the chat box. After the talk, we will pick questions from the Q&A section. Alternately, you can also raise hands after the talk. We will unmute you and let you ask the question directly. Those watching the talk on YouTube can also write their questions on YouTube chat box. We will pick the most relevant questions from there. Before we get into all of these, let me invite Janvi to introduce our speaker, Professor Nanjundiah, to our audience. Janvi, over to you.
Yes. Thanks, Somdatta. And it's a great privilege and honor to introduce today's speaker, Professor Vidyanand Nanjundiah. He's an honorary professor in the Center for Human Genetics in Bangalore. And we rarely get to hear someone whose work has been truly interdisciplinary and inspirational. To give a flavor, he's worked as an assistant professor and associate professor at the Center for Theoretical Studies in Indian Institute of Science. Then he was a professor at the Department of Molecular Reproduction, Development and Genetics, as well as Center for Ecological Sciences at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. He's also been a member of Molecular Biology Unit at TIFR Mumbai, JNCSR in Bangalore. And his work spans developmental biology, theoretical biology, evolution, focusing on understanding evolution of cooperative behavior in slime molds. So slime molds have a life cycle which has two distinct phases, unicellular and multicellular. And he's shown that self-organization via cooperative signaling can explain the cell aggregation and origin of multicellularity. And also very importantly, that kinship may not be so much important to maintain the cooperation in this system. But apart from being an excellent scientist, one of the very important aspects of Nanjundiah sir's career is his dedication to teaching biology to students. And he has taught several subjects ranging from general biology, philosophy of science, evolution, population genetics. And I've had the privilege to attend some of his courses and learn from him, and especially to how to ask a question and investigate from multiple lenses. I'm sure all of us are really excited and looking forward to today's talk, Biology and Autonomous Science. I request Professor Nanjundiah to take over.
Thank you very much for those kind and exaggerated words of praise, Janvi. I hope I don't let you down. Now, let me, before beginning the talk, say a couple of things. First of all, of course, express my thanks to the CCMB Biologue team, two of whose members I've seen for the first time just now, a few minutes ago. Thank you for this invitation, and I hope we'll have an interesting discussion over the next hour or so. The second point I wish to make is that this is not going to be a talk with data, inferences from those data, numbers, and so forth. Rather, it's going to be an attempt on my part to share with you something I've been trying to come to grips with for a long time and have not really quite succeeded. I think I roughly see what I want to say, or the way I see these questions that I'm going to be posing to you as well in a while. But I've not come fully to grips with them. And therefore, this is partly an occasion for me to, if you wish, clarify my own thoughts and to get the benefit of your undoubted expertise as students of molecular biology at CCMB uh, to respond to these thoughts and point out places where I could usefully do some further exploration. So with that, let me begin by giving you this outline, which I've also sent previously in the form of an abstract. I'll first try and introduce you to these two sorts of questions that one asks really in any field of investigation. I've simply called them how and why questions. Then a little bit about what constitutes explanation when we say that we have an explanation that enables to understand some phenomenon. And I'll introduce you briefly to a supposed structure that such explanations exhibits, starting from physical science or physics, if you wish, at the very base. Then I'll point out that answers to this question, why, are of two sorts. Either they involve a sense of something inevitable, because that is what is predicted, that is what is supposed to happen by virtue of some natural law. Newton's law of gravity is the one that we perhaps have learnt about the earliest. Or the answer involves a sense of purpose, a sense that whatever it is that is being investigated has an aim to it. Now, this aim-like character is a common feature both of artifacts, which is to say things made by us, sometimes made by other animals, tools if you wish, and it's also a characteristic of living organisms, which as far as we know are not made by anyone, at least not made in the same sense. The fourth point deals with the three case studies, as I've called them, which I'll present before you. And the aim of these case studies will be to show you that the answer to this why question is not clear-cut in a great many areas of biology. And the three that I'm going to choose for illustration are the genetic code. So that's not really an area of biology, but it's something in biology. Then communication between individuals, and these could be individual cells or individual multicellular organisms. And thirdly, this is the one true phenomenon, if you wish to call it that, something called evolutionary convergence. And I'm sure all of you know what this is, but we'll look at it later. 5 and 6 are going to be very brief, where I will sum up what I've said before and point to my hunch that there's an element, or I should say a possible element, of arbitrariness in biology. In other words, not involving deterministic law-like behavior in biology. And that element of arbitrariness seems to be associated with symbolic communication and information transfer. So I'll say a couple of words about that and finally sum up what I've said before. Okay. Now, the natural sciences are essentially the sciences that deal with what there is in the natural world. And conventionally, the natural world is split up into a non-living part and a living part. And the non-living part of the natural world comes under the purview of the sciences called astronomy, astrophysics perhaps, physics proper, chemistry, and geology or geophysics, or the earth sciences as they're sometimes called. Biology is treated as one of the natural sciences for sure, but it's definitely not part of the non-living world. In fact, the whole thing about biology, of course, the whole thing about thing that makes biology interesting, of course, is that it deals with life and all the, how shall I put it, strange or weird or really completely mind-blowing properties that living organisms exhibit vis-a-vis non-living organisms. Now, among these natural sciences, there's the general acceptance that physics informs chemistry, physics informs astronomy, physics informs the earth sciences, physics also informs biology. Similarly, chemistry informs the earth sciences, chemistry informs biology. At the same time, there is a self-reference aspect to physics, in the sense that none of these other sciences on the face of it seem to have anything to say about physical phenomena per se. Of course, you could ask, if that is the case, where do physical phenomena come from? But that's not a question that I'm either competent to address or indeed to even ask, because that seems to be a far deeper question than many people care to try and grapple with. The question that's going to be posed by us during this talk is, given that in this framework, astronomy, astrophysics, chemistry, the earth sciences, and biology all have a derivative component, meaning all are in some way subject to the principles and phenomena of physics, is it possible that biology nonetheless has an autonomous aspect similar to that of physics, with the specific meaning to autonomy here that biological phenomena fully obey the principles of physics, fully obey the laws of chemistry, but are in no way predictable on the basis of those principles or those laws. So it's in that sense that I refer to autonomy, and where that autonomy comes from, if indeed it exists, we'll see presently. There's a famous paper by P.W. Anderson. By the way, feel free, please, to share these slides with anyone else who might be interested, because the references are given there in these slides. There's a famous paper by P.W. Anderson. The title of the paper is "More is Different." Actually, the paper is interesting for a reason quite apart from the one we are going to make use of today. It's interesting because Anderson wrote it to express his sense of feeling upset at something that we biologists also can sympathize with, namely a sense of feeling upset. This is in Anderson's case. Anderson, by the way, was a famous, what used to be called a solid state physicist, and what these days is called a condensed matter physicist. Died at the age of 90 plus, very recently, I think perhaps 3 or 4 years ago. And he wrote this paper, More is Different, because he wanted to express his, essentially his unhappiness with the way elementary particle physicists, the people who are also sometimes called high energy physicists, thought that theirs was the only basic or fundamental science, and that everything else, including Anderson's field, solid state physics, was a derivative science. And he expresses his resentment at this attitude, and more importantly, points out that the attitude is wrong. The table that you see before you was prepared by Anderson, essentially to indicate the kinds of links that I showed by means of arrows in that simple cartoon you saw a while ago. And this table says, look, there are many, many areas of study in the sciences. Some of them belong to the natural sciences in the way we've looked at it. Others belong to the humanities, so sciences of a different kind, non-natural sciences. In English, we unfortunately use the word science to be restricted, in a sense that is restricted to the natural sciences, but that's not true of other languages. So you could have, certainly in our languages, Vidyanand could mean all sorts of things, including what we now call natural sciences. So Anderson points out here that if you want to study the social sciences, you can study them on their own merit, so sociology if you wish. But you know that ultimately sociology, which is human behavior in the collective, depends on individual human behavior, which is psychology, goes under the name of psychology. Now there are people who call themselves psychologists and they study individual behavior with all its rules and quirks and drives and emotions and what have you. But they acknowledge that psychology depends on whatever is happening inside the body, inside the brain, you know, neuromuscular systems, blood flow, hormonal activity, what have you, which you call physiology. So then you say, okay, I want to study physiology. Physiology in turn depends on something else, you know, perhaps intercellular interactions. You can think this out, and so on and so on. And then you say cell biology depends on molecular biology. Molecular biology rests on chemistry. Chemistry rests on physics of a particular kind. People sometimes call it supra-molecular physics. Physics of many entities put together, also called many-body physics. And many-body physics, or solid state or condensed matter physics, depends ultimately on these high-energy interactions. All this is true, no one denies this. But Anderson was pointing out that taking this picture at face value makes you forget that at each of these levels of explanation, which are listed in column X, in spite of the fact that the explanation rests a great deal on the corresponding informant mentioned in column Y, there's a whole lot of new stuff that goes on. And this new stuff that goes on is by virtue of phenomena coming on the scene, which of course have to follow the rules or the laws or the principles determined by these elements in column Y. But in addition, they involve entirely unexpected and qualitatively different kinds of behavior. You can give many examples. You can come up with your own examples of this kind. One that I use sometimes in teaching, it's a slightly ridiculous example, but you'll see the point. So it goes as follows. It says, look, potassium is essential for you, right? You need potassium for life. Carbon is essential for you. You need carbon for life. Nitrogen is essential for you. You need nitrogen for life. But you put the three of them together and get KCN, and that can become deadly. Now, this fact that KCN is a life taker, whereas K and C and N are independently life givers, if you wish, is a bit bizarre. But there it is. And of course, we know why that happens and so forth. And you can think of many other examples. Hydrogen is something which is gaseous and sort of disappears if you have free hydrogen gas in our atmosphere. Same thing with oxygen. It doesn't quite disappear, but still it's gaseous. So you mix the two of two in the right proportion and you have something that flows, water, and so on and so on. So you have these things which are called emergent properties, and these emergent properties have to do with new phenomena, certainly unexpected phenomena, and on the face of it, unpredictable phenomena, which are fully consistent with the laws that operate at the lower level, but give rise to new behavior at the higher level, the level that you're looking at. So what about living organisms now? Living organisms, of course, have to function entirely within the purview of physical law. No doubt at all. And in fact, this feeling that there's no doubt that living organisms function according to physical law is a very recent feeling. It's not something that people had all along. In fact, for ages, one doesn't know how long, and for all I know, even today in popular belief, life is supposed to be on a pedestal quite different from the one, or rather I should say, put it differently, life is supposed to occupy, if you wish, a status which is quite different from the one occupied by non-living creatures. In fact, when I was at school, there was this very popular exam question which said, distinguish between living and non-living. And you have to draw a line down the middle of the page and make two columns, head one, call one living and the other non-living. And I think you already got 1 mark for doing that. And then if you remembered what you had read, you put down a few properties on the left and a few properties on the right. So there was this idea there's something very, very strange. And this idea still survives in words like spirit and soul and God knows what else, a number of such things. Of course, advances in various aspects, various parts of biological sciences, physiology, biochemistry, more recently genetics, the study of behavior and so on, showed that there are things that living creatures do which do seem rather strange and bizarre to us. But when you probe deeply enough, it appears that it's really the kind of thing that a very clever machine, if you wish, could do. It's not something that should shock you out of your senses and make you think that there's something special here outside the laws of physics. And of course, this whole business of the rise of molecular biology has in one way confirmed people in their view that much of what there is to understand about the properties of living organisms, and extremists would say everything that there is to understand about the properties of living organisms, rests in the kinds of games played by DNA and RNA and proteins, eventually. So, this whole field of molecular biology has acquired a kind of status relative to the rest of biology, similar to what Anderson was expressing about high energy physics relative to the rest of physics. That has happened. So it appears in that sense that we are slowly moving in a direction which confirms that biology too is a derivative science like the others that we listed. But there is this famous saying by Einstein, which is always worth keeping in mind, which is to try and make things as simple as possible, but not simpler. And the point about that saying in our context is that this hierarchical way of representation, while it's not false at all, can be pushed too far. In fact, it can even become simplistic for two reasons. The second reason on this screen is the one that I've already mentioned to you, which is that new phenomena, emergent phenomena, can result from self-organization at the higher level. And the second very interesting reason is that it can give rise to the feeling that top-down effects are absent. In other words, a hierarchical representation, if pushed to the extreme, can leave you with the feeling that the only way to understand something is in terms of what operates at a lower level in the hierarchy, and in particular, that lower levels cannot be influenced by higher levels. Now, that too is something that we have discovered is not correct in biology, particularly in biology, and it's also perhaps not correct in other areas. In fact, if you speak to people who work on gravitation and cosmology, they'll tell you that there is this kind of top-down effect going on there as well. But once again, I'm not sufficiently competent to get into that. Therefore, one should question how valid this popular statement is, and the statement which all of us have heard is all chemistry is physics and all biology is chemistry. Not an entirely false statement. Nonetheless, we should question how valid this statement is, even in spirit. Literally, of course, I think few people would say that it's valid, but in spirit it seems to be okay, but we should question that nevertheless. Okay, that's a sign for me to pause in case any questions have come up so far. And if they have, would you please let me know, one of you? Somdatta, perhaps?
No questions.
No questions, then I pop something for my throat and continue. Okay. Now, the reason we should question that, the reason we should be aware of that simplistic attitude, which I mentioned a while ago, is this equally well-known statement, certainly equally well-known to biologists, which comes from a very distinguished geneticist and evolutionary biologist, a man called Dobzhansky. And it goes, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. In fact, what Dobzhansky is asserting here is, in effect, that top-down explanations lie at the heart of biology. Anything that you want to understand in biology, the behavior of individuals, the behavior of groups, the behavior of tissues, the behavior of cells, the behavior of organelles, the behavior of DNA and RNA, of genes. Nothing about their behavior makes sense. Of course, you might cavil at the word nothing, but that's a different matter. Nothing about their behavior makes sense unless you look at that behavior in the light of evolution, which of course is something happening at a much, much, much larger scale. Now, why did Dobzhansky say this, and why is this something worth thinking of? The simple one-word answer, if you wish to understand what Dobzhansky was saying, is to be found in this feature exhibited by all living organisms to some degree or the other in respect of practically everything that you can think of as making up that organism. The form of those organisms, the behavior of those organisms, the lifestyle, if you wish to call it, adopted by those organisms in different ways, anything. This picture illustrates bird beaks, as you can see, come in a huge variety of sizes and shapes, as indeed do the birds themselves. But the point here is that each of these beaks looks like a specialized device made for some purpose. And indeed, in some cases, you can see directly that beak A would not serve the purpose fulfilled by beak B, and vice versa. So for example, there are beaks here, perhaps the one second from right at the bottom. There are beaks here which are very good for pounding into wood and making holes in the manner of finely tipped hammers. There's a beak here immediately above that, which seems, well, it seems as if it could break a stone with that, and in fact it breaks very hard seeds with that. So it's a nutcracker, if you wish. There are beaks here like this very long, thin curved beak, which really doesn't make any sense at all until you realize that that kind of a shape is necessary if you wish to get into the nectaries of some flowers which have precisely such shaped nectary entrances. So it actually seems a beak made for that purpose, and so on and so forth. There are beaks which look like finely tipped pincers. There are beaks, where is this now? Oh yeah, the one of those on the top, which you can see, which look like claws more or less. So you can see that they can be used to potentially rip apart flesh. So each of these beaks looks like a device designed to fulfill a specialized end. And of course, our understanding today is that that has come about by means of evolution, this adaptation. Okay, keep this in mind. So this looks like the product of design. And remember that here we have design without, of course, a designer. So there's a problem, there's something strange going on. You can't explain these beaks as ipso facto products of physical law, but then you have to come up with the law that gave rise to these designs, and it's not immediately obvious how it would come up with these many different designs. Behavior is adaptive too. So these are meerkats who are standing on top of their underground burrow. They're essentially scouts scanning the environment to watch out for potential predators. presumably the rest of the family, including, well, in particular the young, are inside the burrow. Now, why are they doing this? Quite obviously, if there's a predator who is somewhere in the neighborhood, the members of the family better be warned so that any who are going around and scouring for food in the neighborhood rush back and enter the hive. It's a very sensible job of security guards, if you wish, adaptive behavior. Now, it's interesting that such adaptive behavior is exhibited by products of technology. So we do this all the time. There's a famous piece in a book called Natural Theology, which set Darwin off on his great enterprise, where the product of technology that is chosen for illustration is a watch. Now, obviously, the design in the watch sees, and the intricacies of the sub-components of the watch make you see right away that it is unlikely to have come about naturally in the same way that the sun and the stars and the planets, and for that matter, the rocks on earth and the rivers and the mountains have come about naturally, but someone must have made it, in this case a human being. So these are three products which illustrate the features that we saw in some of those beaks there. You have a pair of pincers on the left, you have a hammer in the middle. Of course, this is just the hammer and not the, it's a hammer that I illustrated earlier, not the nail, which is also here. And on the right side, you have a nutcracker, which again is the same. So it has two opposing jaws with a liver at one extremity, which enables you to crush things, and of course, hardness of material. So products of technology are adaptive too. But here we are not surprised at the adaptations. We say, well, of course, someone sat down and made them. Now, look at the differences involved. Both of these things that we saw involve answers to the why question. And now let me repeat what the differences between these questions are. The how question, how does such and such a thing happen, essentially relates to the immediate or the proximate causes that led up to that thing happening. So how, shall we say, does the earth go around the sun? Well, it's pretty simple. There's something called a gravitational force. There's something called an initial velocity which the earth has, presumably from the moment of its birth. And you can show rather easily that this results in a certain kinematic path around the sun. That path is an ellipse, as you know. Why does the earth go around the sun? Simple answer, because of the law of gravity. It's a natural law. Now, how do these three devices that you see here in front of you work? Very easy to understand. They're all levers of one kind or the other, and you know the principle of the lever. Why are these three devices there? We've given the answer already. They are there because someone made them. Same question for this behavior or for these beaks. How did these beaks come into being? Well, you have this whole area called developmental biology with all its ramifications and exciting happenings almost every day, which tell you how beaks are formed. Why are these beaks there? Well, quite obviously, they seem to be there to either crack nuts or make holes in wood or very delicately pick up insects or whatever, things of those kinds that you can identify immediately. But this doesn't address the question of why they came to be there precisely in the same way that we answered the question why for these three human devices. We said there was a purpose. So where does that sense of purpose come from? Now, Darwin and Wallace announced to mixed acclaim over 150 years ago that they had found out where that sense of purpose came from. And that was by this notion that they put forward called natural selection. And I'm not going to take you through natural selection at all. That will be many talks in itself. But this slide summarizes the essential features of what I want to convey. And the notion of natural selection at its heart tells you how you can get design without purpose. It's a very strange kind of thing to get used to, but you have something which looks like a product of design without any intent beforehand in shaping such a product. In other words, without any purpose. And it's precisely this aspect of natural selection, i.e., its claim to show that you could get design without purpose, that has made it a subject of fairly lively discussion ever since Darwin and Wallace. And I think it's fair to say that whereas the vast majority of biologists, well, let me rephrase that. It's fair to say that whereas everyone who does biology, and certainly all evolutionary biologists, believe natural selection to be an extremely important mechanism for explaining evolutionary change, and in fact, largely precisely because of its ability to explain adaptation. Even though that is true, still it remains true that a substantial minority of biologists, ever since Darwin and Wallace, have kept questioning the sufficiency of natural selection for explaining all features of living organisms. Keep that in mind. So it's not that people are opposed to natural selection, but that people say that you might need something else in addition to natural selection to explain some feature of natural biology. And of course, there aren't too many candidates in the field. Something else can only mean natural law. No one here is speaking of black magic or something like that. So it has to be ordinary physical law, physics and chemistry. The one point about natural selection that grated on many people when Darwin and Wallace put it forward was this notion that the elementary variations on which natural selection acts, the basic variations on which natural selection acts, are, as we would say today, random, meaning they act in all possible directions. There's no greater likelihood of an advantageous variation occurring than a disadvantageous variation occurring. And of course, the question immediately was, if the variations themselves occur at random, how on earth can you get this seeming design that you claim results from all of this? And the answer was selection. It's selection that gives you this apparent design-based feature to living organisms. As I said, I won't go into this in detail. For our purposes, we'll just highlight the phrase random mutations. Right. How does this happen? Well, lots of details. This is the famous example of Darwin's finches, where you can show that by really extremely clever, even though inferential reasoning, there's no direct evidence, obviously, though these days molecular biology has helped out a lot, or what's now called evo-devo, molecular biology combined with evolutionary thinking. You can build up very, very plausible cases for how an ancestral finch beak was adapted to serve different ends of the kinds precisely that are illustrated in this cartoon. And there's a very curious example of how behavior might have evolved, and this is in particular the behavior called imprinting. By the way, molecular biologists have stolen this word from behavioral biologists, who are its proper custodians. So you should look up the reference given here to see where the word imprinting comes from. And the behavior that's being referred to here in this shown by this picture is the behavior of very young, in this case, either ducklings or goslings, I can't make out, following their mother instinctively, except that in this case, Konrad Lorenz has fooled them into thinking he is their mother. And those who don't know this really fascinating story in the history of behavioral biology, evolution of behavior and behavioral biology, should look it up. So we have very good cases for how this can happen. Right. So I repeat what I said when I use the word random. An evolutionary explanation is a historical explanation. And like all historical explanations, it involves accidents, contingencies, unforeseen things happening which make you change direction, which make things change direction, I should say. In fact, think of ordinary history. Evolution by natural selection is as much of a continuous logical thread as ordinary history is. And it's practically impossible to reconstruct it in full detail looking back. And again, as an analogy, I'd take you to ordinary history. One of the things that I have seen myself in my life so far is how much people to this day dispute the causes that led up to the partition of India. And as a case study in the uncertainties of history, I can think of few things to compare with that. So at best, you can say this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened, and so forth, with elements of seeming randomness in between. Right, okay, second pause. Any questions now?
No, sir, there are no questions. You can.
No questions at all. Okay, go on. I was hoping for some respite, but okay. Right. Now I come to these three case studies, which I will take you through very rapidly before we wrap up this talk. The first case study has to do with what is called, and the terminology is interesting in our context. The first case study has to do with what is called translating the language of DNA into the language of proteins. In other words, of using this implicit representation of certainly amino acids, but also of polypeptides contained within DNA to the explicit representation, which is of course the thing itself, the amino acid itself or the polypeptide chain itself, the protein itself. And all of you know the various steps that go through this. And all of you also know that the central interpretative element in this act, and for good reason it's called translation, is of course what goes on thanks to the help of the ribosome, which is a reading of triplet bases, and at least that's the way we learn it, and by an act of association, letting an amino acid corresponding to that triplet base join the growing polypeptide chain. So what is happening here really is very similar to translation in the usual linguistic sense, where you take, now your linguist would say a phoneme, but for our purpose, we'll just call it a word, where you take a word, which is essentially a combination of sounds, like the sounds that I'm meaning. Now, each of you listening to me listens to the sounds, but you don't get the meaning of those sounds because there's no meaning in what I'm uttering. I'm just creating air waves, waves of pressure, which are also made up of oscillations at different frequencies. These go as transverse waves, and there's this whole business of electromagnetic communication, but let's pretend we are sitting next to each other. So these waves of air pressure excite nerve cells in your ear, and after that it's just, nerve impulses all the way. In fact, throughout, there's really no such thing in the usual sense of sound that gets through to you, but your brain somehow tells you that this is this series of wave trains that I'm producing in my mouth. Secondly, the sounds that I'm making are, as far as we can tell, perfectly arbitrary. So let's take an immediate example. When I say sound, so that's a particular series of wave trains. But I could also make a different series of wave trains and call it maybe dhvani, completely different. But most of you will say I'm saying the same thing. That's because of this interpretation that goes on inside your mind. Therefore, the actual sounds that I make are arbitrary, whereas the meaning that you extract from those sounds is something quite different. And of course, you're able to extract those meanings simply because of learning. You learn to associate. This is in the same way that you would learn a foreign language which is new to you, in which case you associate completely different sounds with meanings. Now, this seemingly arbitrary association is what we call the genetic code. I picked this slide in particular with its color coding, even though I won't have the time to go through the color code, because I'd like you people to look at this reference by Wong, which gives you a different insight on the genetic code, and in fact, an insight closer to what we will come to at the moment. But on the face of it, this genetic code is really a translation book. So it simply says, look up 3 letters in the left column and you get the name of an amino acid in the right column. Absolutely no relationship on the face of it between these triplets in the left column and the amino acids in the right column. In fact, the very early efforts at trying to understand where this association came from said that, look, so let's go back to that. This is so arbitrary, so in a literal sense, meaningless. There's no meaning within itself except what you associate with it, exactly like ordinary language, that it must have a physical basis. And the simplest physical basis you can think of is a structural basis. And there's this brilliant paper by a man called George Gamow, which tried to come up with a stereochemical explanation for the genetic code. Remember, we are trying to associate triplets of nucleotides with amino acids. So this said that these amino acids fit in a very particular way into the grooves made by the DNA double helix. And you should read up Gamow's paper to know more. In fact, what you come up with if you follow his recipe is precisely 20 amino acids. You know, the aim of the game then was to come up with this magic figure of 20, and Gamow said, I can work out 20 for you this way. There are many other very, very clever ways of trying to explain where this genetic code came from. Even people like Richard Feynman, whose name you will have heard, got into that, and many, many other people. Crick, of course, got into the act with his famous comma-less code, which you should also read up about. It's one of the most exciting phases historically in the history of molecular biology. Finally, of course, all of these things seem to come, or I should say, seem to go nowhere, come to nothing. And people said, look, the genetic code is there, you have to live with it, it's what it is, in the same way that you have to live with these bizarre sounds you make that you call language. It's there. Crick used the phrase frozen accident to refer to this. He said, look, somehow at some stage this correspondence was made. So the mechanics of the transcription, well, not transcription, so what, the mechanics of the translation apparatus was set in place. And once it was set in place, that was it. Now, of course, it's true. Any mutation you make can be really pretty bad for you, if not lethal, most of the time. If you, so you know this already. That's a conventional view. And that's also the view that I think by and large people think is correct today. There are many non-conventional views. I told you about Wong a while ago, which you should read up. One of those non-conventional views, which is very interesting from the point of view of what we've been talking about, this came about from a study by Freeland and Hurst about, I think, 10 years ago now, or maybe more, maybe about closer to 20 years ago. You know, what they did was very clever, and they did a bit of computer research, which in fact needs to be updated with the extra information available today. And if one of you is interested, you should follow this up. What they said was, look, you say the genetic code is arbitrary, fine, which means you can cook up any genetic code you want where you associate any triplet whatsoever with a particular amino acid. All you want to know finally is that you get those 61 correct triplets. You know, you leave 3 aside, it's something to do with chain termination and so on. So let's ignore that. That's no amino acid, so we don't want to be bothered with that. So you basically want a correspondence between these 61 triplets, 4 into 4 into 4 minus 3, and 20 amino acids. And you can come up with a huge, huge number. Of course, you'll waste your lifetime to do that. So the computer does it for you. So having done that, now you rig up amino acid sequences on the computer and get proteins. These are computer generated proteins. And then you ask the computer, how good are these proteins? So you ask this from the question of how reliable can you use these proteins for what proteins do. And reliability is understood here to mean how stable is the system with respect to mutations. So for example, if a great many amino acids in your code, please remember these are arbitrary associations you're making. So there's some redundancy and so forth. If a great many amino acids in your code happen to give rise to a stop codon via a single base pair chain, you can see that that's not good for you. That's unlikely to be very good if you can go to a stop codon in one jump. On the other hand, if these amino acids that you have are robust to such changes, so that most changes take you from one amino acid to a similar amino acid, you might be better off. So you can now assess how robust the code that you have cooked up is relative to the code that you actually have. I hope the spirit of what they tried comes through. And in fact, they came out with the surprising answer that if you look at the distribution of robustness of different genetic codes, the one that we actually have is something like a factor of 1 in a million better than any other randomly generated code. So for those of you who are used to doing sequence comparisons and so forth, you're familiar with what are called p-values. So you get a p-value of something like 0.1 in a million. So 0.501 is a possibility that purely by random chance, you could get a genetic code which is as good as the code you have or better. So you rule it out. So that's an interesting thought. The genetic code could have been the result of natural selection. The third point is the one that came up as a result of many experiments carried out by a person called Paul Schimmel. And the experiments basically had to do with addressing the following question. In the code that you know, there's this molecule called transfer RNA, tRNA, which plays the central role. And you know that central role is played by virtue of there being something called an anticodon loop, which binds with this triplet codon in messenger RNA, and something called an acceptor stem, to which the cognate amino acid is brought and attached via an enzyme, which is the amino acid tRNA synthetase. So the central decoders are the tRNA molecule and the synthetase. What Schimmel and company showed was that you could get rid of the anticodon loop, in fact, work just with the acceptor stem and use something there as a kind of filler, sometimes to make a small loop right there at the top, and nonetheless the system would work. So you could successfully charge this kind of truncated or crippled tRNA molecules which don't contain any anticodon loop with the correct amino acid most of the time. So there's something going on in the acceptor stem itself, and as far as we know, the only thing there can be chemical binding. So they suggested that perhaps a precursor of this highly error-resistant genetic code that we have may have been ordinary sloppy chemistry of the kind all of us know. And indeed, this sort of charging is very sloppy because the correct amino acid is not chosen with the high fidelity that it is by the real tRNA molecule, but with a much, much lower fidelity. So the distribution of correct amino acids is far wider than it is now. It's not as sharply peaked. but very interesting. So chemistry alone now, which of course is one way of saying physical law. I'll skip over this side. All of you know this. Gene expression, as Jacob and Monod showed long ago, also exhibits features that you can call arbitrary, and this was in their discovery of the phenomenon of induction, in their study of the lac operon, because the thing that does the induction need not be related. Remember these experiments with IPTG, need not be related with the function of what is induced, which is in this case the beta galactosidase enzyme. But I'll skip over that. But the point here being, again, possible arbitrary feature. Animal communication, very, very similar to human language in the sense that while it's not as sophisticated, it too seems to exhibit these arbitrary features, a very primitive, extremely primitive kind of language. Of course, serious linguists will say, therefore don't call it language, call it something else. Fine, you can do that. But nonetheless, it seems to be a form of symbolic communication is all that I want to say, with the symbols being one thing and the message being something else. Remember, that's the essence of this whole business of going from the language of DNA or going from one language to another language. More spectacular examples of animal communication. And here, the explanation for what's called sexual dimorphism, the explanation that Darwin came up with for this exuberant display of tail feathers by the males and the lack, indeed the inability of the female to show anything like it. The explanation that Darwin gave for this, which was later buttressed by a number of people, including R.A. Fisher, was that this is arbitrary. This is an arbitrary language. And in fact, Darwin went so far as to say that it's the aesthetics of this peacock's tail feather display which appeals to us, which also appeals to the peahen, which of course aroused enormous controversy because he seemed to be granting peafowl as much aesthetic sensibility as highly refined Englishmen and women, which wasn't a nice idea at the time. Similarly, all kinds of things in behavior, this courtship dance or mating dance of the great crested grebe. Again, the explanation is that it's essentially an arbitrary exchange of signals of communication. Remember, it's the arbitrariness that's troubling us here, because if it's arbitrary, there seems to be no explanation ipso facto based on physical law, unlike what we just now a while ago saw for the genetic code. Very arbitrary. Signal transduction by cells. You have a signal, in this case it happens to be a growth factor, and you have something which happens inside the cell, which is all kinds of kinases getting activated, finally perhaps some gene getting expressed. But the nature of the signal seems to have, so that's the language at the outside of the cell, seems to have nothing to do with any of these kinases, which is the language going on inside the cell. And you could have other signals in which you get cyclic AMP produced inside the cell, perhaps as a second messenger. And the nature of the signal has nothing to do with that, because all kinds of signals produce cyclic AMP. So once again, you have an element of apparent arbitrariness between a signal and the response to the signal or the interpretation of that signal. There's no chemistry involved here once you cross the cell, once you cross the plasma membrane. Remember, there's a lot of chemistry inside. There may be a great deal of chemistry outside as well, the metabolic pathway leading to the synthesis of the growth factor. But in the transition from outside to inside, there's no chemistry. It's arbitrary signaling. So on what basis is the signal chosen? The general consensus, as I said, is that there's no particular reason behind this choice. Of course, a physical consideration would say, and this is what electrical engineers and communication engineers will tell you all the time, well, use the cheapest way of communicating that you can, so that you have minimal expense incurred, and at the same time, you have reliability so that the signal to noise ratio is as high as you can expect. So you use materials of the right kind, you use technological signal generators of the right kind, etc., etc. I'll skip over this. There's a very nice idea floated by a person called Amos Zahavi called the Handicap Principle, which says that biological signals too are generated on a basis similar to that used by electrical, electronic, and communication engineers. In other words, Zahavi says that biological signals too are chosen essentially on economic considerations because they are cheap to make. In addition to assuring you that they're reliable because the signals are secure, they cannot be copied easily. I'll let you read this up, but I'll just leave you with this thought, which is my aim here, which is to say that even in the case of intracellular or interorganismal signaling, interorganismal or intercellular communication, where on the face of it, it appears that the signals used are arbitrary, someone has come up with an interesting way of arguing that no, the signals need not be arbitrary, that they may in fact depend strongly on physical criteria, if you wish, engineering criteria. But I'll let you look that up simply because I'm overshooting my time badly. My last case study has to do with what's called convergent evolution. Again, all of you will have studied this. So this is the example of evolution having led to similar adaptive design, and the adaptations here in this sketch are the ones that subserve burrowing in the soil, ant eating, well, that's a highly specialized adaptation. Again, a kind of nocturnal burrowing lifestyle like that of the mouse, climbing, gliding, etc., etc. But this has been reached independently by two groups that separated 160 million years ago, long before these adaptations arose. And the conventional explanation for this, of course, this phenomenon called convergent evolution, is that similar evolutionary pressures, similar environmental pressures, led to natural selection shaping the design of these creatures in these uncannily similar ways. The example of convergent evolution that is a favorite to me, Jahnavi mentioned slime molds. They are the ones illustrated in the bottom picture here. And what you see in the top picture is something called myxobacteria. Very, very similar life cycle. Again, uncannily similar, except that here, the separation is perhaps 1 billion years ago, if not more. Very nice example from the plant world, first presented to us by Biologue, the Russian geneticist and evolutionary biologist, which shows that these 4 groups of plants, very, very distantly related, nonetheless end up with the same kinds of forms, with the same kinds of designs. Again, convergent evolution, but with a twist, which is that you have varieties which are similar across these hugely separated phylogenies. The question which has been raised in recent years, another famous example, sorry, I forgot I'd included this, 2 groups of fish separated again across families, shown by Darcy Thompson to be able to be transformed from one to the other by means of a simple geometrical transformation. Now, of course, what underlies that geometrical transformation is a different matter altogether. Thompson doesn't address it, but he says that in principle, you don't need natural selection to explain this. So what I want to say is that as with the other examples we have seen, these cases of convergent evolution too are now being sought to be explained as end products, not of natural selection, but of physical laws making only certain end products possible. And the analogy that people draw in making this comparison is to something called multi-stability, which is a familiar feature both in solid chemistry as well as in the more conventional reaction chemistry we know, where you can have a chemical reaction or a chemical process with a certain number of defined endpoints, not open-ended. And if you want a specific example, think of the allotropes of carbon. I don't know what the number is today. In school, we learned of diamond, graphite, and soot. Now, of course, you have C60, you have graphene, you have nanotubes, etc. But still, it doesn't add up to more than, I would guess, a dozen or so. All of these are carbon atoms stuck together in one way or the other, but they give rise only to this limited number of end products. So the thinking, obviously not in such simple terms, is that something similar may be at work in biology as well. Okay, now I'm actually going to end this talk without asking for a pause, even though this slide tells me to pause. So the question I'm leaving you with, that I have been trying to address all the while, is which is a better explanation for these phenomena we've been looking at? Is it natural selection or ordinary physical law, which is the usual sort of deterministic answer? And I suggest that at least in some aspects of the phenomena that force you to ask this question, the distinction really has to do with this distinction between symbol and meaning, with whether the meaning is implicit in the symbol or whether the symbol is actually completely arbitrary. And I tried to show you that in two cases, there are reasons for thinking that the symbol might not be completely arbitrary. One was the case of the genetic code. The other was the case of intercellular or inter-individual communication. Of course, if the symbol is not arbitrary, you have a logical reason why the meaning is a particular, has a particular meaning. Which brings me again to the point we started with, which is biology an arbitrary science? And I suggest that this notion of arbitrariness is tied up with take that back. This notion of autonomy is tied up with that of arbitrariness. And I think the case for treating biology as autonomous gets strengthened to the extent that you can show that a particular feature of a living organism is not explainable by deterministic natural law alone, but needs this arbitrary element inside it, where you say things happened in the past, a great many things could have happened, but it so was, conditions were such as to allow only this to happen out of a great many potential possibilities. So the number of possible forms of life is infinite. The actual form which has been chosen on this earth is what you see before you. The rival claim, of course, is that the number of possible forms is not infinite, but is very, very severely constrained by physics and chemistry. So I end there and thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, Professor Nanjundiah. So our audience can raise their hands and ask their questions directly to Professor Nanjundiah. In the meantime, I see that a lot of young, there have been a lot of young audience as well for our session today. And one of them is a grade 10 student, and I'll probably start with his question. So he has been very eager to know from you that, so he says, we have studied that body is made up of cells, whereas in physics we have learned that body has atoms and free electrons to conduct electricity.
Look, I'm very sorry, but could you say that again? Could you repeat that slowly? I couldn't hear you.
Sure. So Dupont says or asks, we have studied that body is made up of cells, whereas in physics we have learned that body has atoms and free electrons to conduct electricity. So what is the basic in our body? And Dupont is a grade 10 student.
I'm not sure I follow the question. Bodies are made up of cells, that's true. And cells are made up of what have you, all sorts of molecules, solids, liquids. They in turn are made up of smaller molecules, which in turn are made up of atoms. And of course, you could go even deeper and say the atoms consist of nuclei and electrons. And the electrons, the nuclei are made up of neutrons and protons and so forth. Now, Was that the question, or was it something else?
Yes. So basically, he wants to understand, so what would you call as the most basic unit of life? Would
Of
that
life. Oh, okay. That's an extremely interesting question. Very, very interesting question. I'm not sure I have an answer, but I'll tell you how I think about it. I think that the essence of life, again, I come back to the word I've used here, is the ability to convey this principle of autonomy. People sometimes call it agency. I'm not sure if it's a good word, but it's catching on these days, which means that you look at something and it behaves in a way that appears or exhibits features that appears weird to you. You won't expect that kind of thing from a rock or a stone, or anything else in the non-living world. That's not a very good answer, by the way, because things in the non-living world can also surprise you. And you know that there are many features in non-living matter which can rather successfully mimic those same features in living matter. And the whole field of engineering device has thrown up now examples of robots and so-called artificial intelligences, which certainly if you were simply to interact with them, for example, might fool you into thinking they're living matter. But generally, you can figure out if something is alive or not. And I suggest that the test for that is whether it exhibits agency or not. So there are a number of criteria of this thing that's called agency. One is an ability to distinguish between yourself and someone else. So of course, you know yourself, who you are and who someone else is. Now, if you are looking at something from the outside, you can ask, is this thing behaving in ways that makes me think that it's able to discriminate between itself and something outside? In other words, something that makes me think that it has a sense of self. So that's one property of agency. The other property of agency is to be able to indulge, again, I come back to the same word, in what looks to us like autonomous behavior. So behavior to which there is no apparent external cause that you can see. So there are a great many of these signs. And then of course there are the other usual textbook sorts of definitions. The system is thermodynamically open, it exchanges matter and energy with the outside, right? Is able to self-organize and so forth. So coming back to cells, or coming back to organisms, I would say cells are certainly arrived by any of these criteria. Cells also reproduce, which is a rather elementary property we associate with life as we know it. So they are there. Now, organelles inside the cell are probably not alive in that sense. At least I can't think of them. But you can think of these funny things like molecular motors. Now, are they alive or not? I think that's really up to you. You know, I started with this famous school question of distinguish between living and non-living. I think the significance of that question has evaporated. It's no longer, they probably still ask you to answer it in school, but it's not treated as a very serious question in principle any longer. Okay, that's a long-winded answer, sorry.
All right. Rahul, would you want to ask your question? You can unmute yourself.
Yeah. Hello. Hi, sir.
Hi.
Thanks for this wonderful and captivating talk. I just wanted to conclude by the final question. So is biology an autonomous science? So can I just go and say partly yes, that it is partly autonomous? Is that what you wanted to conclude? Because you never formally answered the question.
I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer.
Okay.
Look, I'm okay. Since you asked me for my opinion, I'm torn between two thoughts. One is precisely as you put it, and the other one is to say, look, you can't be both autonomous and non-autonomous, right? If there's any element of autonomy at all, that means you don't fully come under the purview of deterministic laws. You know what I mean? So if there's even a tiny bit of you which is autonomous, that's enough.
Yes. I understand. Yeah.
All right. So there are two questions which I think are very similar to each other. And the question basically is, when natural selection happens, does it happen at the molecular level or at a larger level that is being affected by the environment directly?
Okay, I'll give you a short answer. For a long and what will be a much more fascinating answer, I request you to spend some time with Jahnavi. The short answer is natural selection can act at many levels. Natural selection basically acts on entities that satisfy the following three criteria. One is what's called variation. So these entities must differ from each other. Secondly, what is called heritability, which means that these entities must have the property of reproducing, and the differences that they exhibit must be reflected in their children or their offspring, whatever. That's called heritability. They may not be exactly repeated, but must be reflected in some fashion. And thirdly, allied to the first two properties, these entities must exhibit, precisely because of the variations we talked about, and precisely because there's a component of those variations that is heritable. Precisely because of that, these entities must exhibit what's called differential reproduction. In common language, they must differ in what's called fitness as well. If they can satisfy these three criteria, natural selection will operate as a logical consequence, not because of some mysterious reason, not because Darwin and Wallace said so, as a logical consequence. So there's nothing mysterious about the consequence. Of course, what is interesting is, are the assumptions valid? And it's the business of evolutionary biologists to go out and test whether the assumptions are valid. Now, the level at which these entities exist can certainly be DNA molecules, been shown, can certainly be genes, which are also DNA molecules, but as you know, with some extra properties to them, can work at the level of cells, for sure. At the tissue level, I'm not very sure of immediately. Maybe Jahnavi can say something after this. Certainly act at the level of individuals, and that's the most common level at which we think of natural selection acting. But interestingly, can also act at the level of groups of individuals. Now you might say, how big is that group? Can they act at the level of entire populations, meaning the species as a whole? Probably not. In fact, I would guess almost certainly not, but certainly at the level of largest groups. So all of those.
So Mohammed Singh, who had asked the previous question, also had a follow-up question to it. He wants to know, there are some things which are happening beyond natural selection, as you said, convergent evolution. At what level and where is that happening biologically?
No, I didn't say that's happening beyond natural selection. I'm sorry. So let me clarify. Convergent evolution, or the observation of something that you call convergent evolution, is a fact, right? So it's a deduction based, it's an inference drawn from what you see around you. So there's no question about that. The dispute is about the mechanism that has brought this about. And natural selection continues to be, I must say, the most popular mechanism. So different creatures from different starting points were subject to the same forces and have ended up in the same place, so to speak. You know what I mean? So that's a conventional explanation. No quarrel with that at all in principle. The alternative explanation which I was trying to put forward, and I think Vavilov's series, which I showed you, are perhaps a better illustration than those marsupial and eutherian mammals. The alternative explanation is that rather than natural selection being responsible for these design-like features, please remember, we're talking about design here. You know, there were all these words on the left-hand side which showed what the specific aspect of design in question was. So the alternative explanation is that these design-like features came about simply because the number of possibilities open via variation was not infinite. Mutations were not open-ended, but rather the laws of physics and chemistry acting on the starting system, which was some common ancestor of eutherians and marsupials, the last common ancestor of eutherians and marsupials. The laws of physics and chemistry acting on this common ancestor after it had split presumably, so two common ancestors, were capable of shaping only a limited number of outcomes. And it's that limited number of outcomes that you see. So this is where the analogy to the allotropes of carbon comes in. You can only do this many things. You think mutations in all possible directions are in fact actually possible, but they're not. I hope you see the point. So these are two alternatives. Yeah.
So one of the next question that we'll go to is this: does the balance between autonomy and arbitrariness change with complexity in biological systems, cells to species communities? Is autonomy more a characteristic of subcellular processes since they interface more closely with chemical or physical processes?
Autonomy.
Yeah.
No, I would say the other way around. In fact, this is the interesting part about biology, right? Someone asked earlier about at what level life begins. You can see clearly that once you go inside cells, it's really all physics and chemistry. And as you also know, there's this whole field of synthetic biology, which tells you that if I replicate that physics and chemistry, I can replicate the biological phenomenon. And that's been done successfully in a great many cases. So autonomy seems to begin at a somewhat higher level. It begins at a level where this sense of agency takes hold, certainly at the level of cells. I can't think of a level lower than that of cells where it can usefully be said to operate, certainly at the level of cells, and obviously at the level of individuals. Certainly, all of us operate under the illusion, at least, that we are free agents. I hope you do.
Kasbekar wants to know, are there examples of interspecies communication? So for an example, he says, some people think dogs and humans can communicate with each other to some extent. Is that real communication?
Now, is this the famous Dr. Kasbekar or someone else?
The famous one.
It is, okay. Hi, Durgadas. Now, yes, so dogs and humans communicate with each other, certainly. And there's a whole big book written by the same person whose name I mentioned earlier, Konrad Lorenz, which contains examples of inter-individual communication really, but between members of different species. And Lorenz has very amusing examples of how he managed to teach himself to communicate with crows, with geese. The fascinating example. So you can do that. All you need to do is to use the right symbols in the right way. And of course, there are people who claim now, I mean, I don't claim to understand this fully, who claim that apes, at least some apes, can be taught some elements of human language, and they claim they have successfully communicated with them on that basis. There are very nice videos on this by a lady called Sue Rumbaugh. I forget her first name, Diane, I think, Sue Rumbaugh, which are fascinating at least to watch. I'm not very sure of the interpretation.
Correct. Mohammed Singh is back with his questions on autonomy, and I'm just going to take this because I think he makes an interesting point here. So talking of autonomy, he wants to know, does it also apply at organelle level, especially organelles like mitochondria?
Yeah, mitochondria, I think, certainly they can, by the way, there is a form of natural selection going on which involves mitochondria, and I'm sure all of you know this. So you could certainly think of it, mitochondria as being, in that sense, autonomous. After all, they exhibit heritability too. they can reproduce and so forth. Yeah, I would go along with that.
Karthikeyan wants to know, how do we reconcile the patterns that biological organisms and communities show a striking similarity to mathematical expectations, such as Fibonacci numbers? So basically, how do we connect the patterns that we see in biological organisms and mathematical formulae, mathematical form?
Let me rephrase the question and you tell me whether I'm rephrasing it accurately. Are you saying how is it that you can develop mathematical models involving equations and whatever to describe biological phenomena? Is that the question?
What Karthik wants to know is, how do we explain the emergence of patterns in organisms which actually emerge out of mathematical formulae or something?
So is your question about the efficacy of mathematics? Why does mathematics work? Is that the question?
Maybe I would like Karthik to come online and ask his question. Yeah, Karthik, please go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, thanks for the wonderful talk. My question was that many biological organisms during just the structure, the morphology, or even a collection of species and the way they organize themselves in communities seem to match with some mathematical expectation like Fibonacci numbers. So how do you explain this uncanny, connection or similarity? Is this biology or is this something else?
Well, to begin with, every such instance that I know or I know of is not uncanny at all. It's exactly the same kind of correspondence you would expect to find between mathematics, or rather the explanatory power of mathematics, and physical or chemical systems. So the answer in short is there are statistical regularities exhibited by aggregates of entities. And many of these statistical regularities, of course, can be expressed in mathematical language. And you will get them when you have a large herd of animals, a large number of cells, or a large number of anything else whatsoever of a similar kind. Simply statistical regularities. Okay. The second kind of thing is that when you have individual entities and you're reasonably confident about the manner in which they interact with each other, you can of course describe those interactions in terms of mathematics. And perhaps the most famous example of this in biology has to do with this interesting observation made, when was it, more than 100 years ago, where people discovered, fisher communities in the north of Italy discovered that their fishing catches went through periodic variations. So they had years of good catches followed by years of terrible catches and good catches again and terrible catches again. And slightly at around the same time, pelt hunters, fur hunters in the Arctic discovered that their catch of furs went through similar cyclicities, even though the intensity of hunting was the same throughout. And we now explain this in terms of simple predator-prey interactions. And there the underlying phenomenon simply is, so if you look at the fox and rabbit analogy, foxes eat rabbits, rabbits eat grass. You have a pretty much unending supply of grass, and this automatically gives rise to periodicities. You don't need anything more. So you can actually cloak what is a verbal common sense description of something that is happening based on certain behavioral attributes. You can cloak it in mathematical language and it works more and more accurately the larger the numbers of individuals involved, because then statistical laws, which are simply things that say that in the aggregate, things are much more dependable than they are individually. It's as simple as that. And you don't need any mathematics to explain that. Statistical laws start operating. So I think, you know, this is really, there's no uncanny element to this at all. And of course, inside the cell, as I said before, it's all physics and chemistry, except it's somewhat larger molecules playing these games than what we think of as molecules when we first study them.
Sudipta, would you like to ask your question directly?
Just to follow up on what I was saying, I don't think there's anyone around in biology today who would question the entirely materialistic nature of biological phenomena. In fact, it's almost become a cliche now to call biology the science of living matter. And I can't think of anyone who would question that.
So actually, following up with that, there's a question on YouTube, which I think can also has a huge philosophical angle to it. So the question asked is, what is the goal of the cell? Now, I think I would also build up on that question and ask, like, is it necessary for us to think of a cell as something which has a goal, or things happen to that cell just by its arbitrary nature?
Right. No, obviously, that's a very deep philosophical question. Now, my understanding is, which is all I can convey, is the following. I think a cutting plier or a hammer or a nutcracker, all of them have goals in the sense that they were made with a particular purpose in mind. In that sense, it appears that there is no goal associated with any living entity, but there's certainly the very, very strong resemblance to its having a goal. Almost anything a living creature does seems to be purposeful, right? And the whole aim of evolutionary biology has been to explain the origin of this seeming purposefulness. And natural selection has come up as a rather attractive explanation. When I tried to suggest that physical law might be an alternative to some cases to natural selection, I was by no means trying to say that that meant a non-materialistic explanation. Both of them are materialistic, right? But they work in completely different ways. Both of them depend on properties of matter. In fact, it's interesting, if you read The Origin of Species, which I strongly recommend all of you to do, because it's a fantastic book in the sense of both being hard science and being very readable, you know, almost bedtime reading, though you have to read it many, many, many times to actually get out all the richness in it. If you read The Origin of Species, right at the end, in this almost poetic section, Darwin tries to compare natural selection to the law of gravity. Of course, he doesn't stick his neck out so far as to say that this is the equivalent of the law of gravity. He was already in trouble with his ideas and their seeming implications for humans, for human evolution. So he doesn't do that. But you can see that. In fact, he says almost in so many words that this enormous richness of the living world, what you call biodiversity now, has come about by the action of natural selection, essentially since ever, you know, hundreds or thousands of millions of years, in the same way that the earth has kept circling around the sun for whatever, hundreds or thousands of millions of years. It's worth looking at that. You can see him very tentatively putting out a toe into this very dangerous pond, but that comes right at the very end, and it's hardly ever referred to when people, obviously it doesn't have to do with natural selection per se, but with a metaphor.
All right. Thank you so much. I do not see any more questions or anybody raising hands here right now. So with that, I'll close the session and thank you very, very much, Professor Nanjundiah, for this lovely engaging session.
Thank all of you too. Thank Biologue.
Yes.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.